seated. Well, I know the NFL playoffs are on a lot of your minds, and I just want you to know I only got one email asking how long my sermon was. I wanted to make sure they could get to the game. I assure you, we will have plenty of time to get to the game. There's a lot of other big things going on this weekend. Presidential inauguration, celebrating Martin Luther King Day. Also Maverick surf competition. The NHL has started. Heck, there's big things going on. In any event, I imagine that this wedding at Cana of Galilee probably would have been considered a big event by the people of that town, but also a very common event. And they were probably pretty excited about it. Right off the bat, this wedding, this story, has some interesting dimensions that catch my attention at least, but I imagine there were some things in there that caught your attention. I heard some people chuckling at a remark in that story. But take, for instance, one of the things that jumps out at me is this interaction between Jesus and his mother. Don't you think it's a little bit, I don't know, strange? What? Rude. Well, I'm going to jump ahead of my sermon and say that was one of my comments. If I had talked to my mom like that, I might be standing in front of you, but I'm not sure. In any event, it's an interesting exchange, and nowhere are we given her name. It just says Jesus and his mother. And in fact, if you look through the whole Gospel of John, this woman is always called the mother of Jesus. We are never told that her name is Mary. That's kind of an interesting thing to me. And it's interesting, too, that she shows up in only 2 places in the Gospel. She shows up right at the beginning, at this story that begins Jesus' ministry, and then we see her at the very end of the Gospel. You might recall that rather poignant picture, at least in my mind, where it says she was standing, the mother of Jesus and the disciple that Jesus loved were standing at his cross. Kind of brackets his ministry in a way. And it's also interesting, I found out, that this is the only place in all of the Bible, any of the Gospels, anywhere written, where there is a conversation between the adult Jesus and his mother. Kind of interesting stuff to me. So clearly something is going on in this story than just a mom and her son talking about trying to figure out a way to run to the liquor store to get more wine for the party. Something bigger is going on here. And speaking of wine, why do they need so much? I mean, that's a lot of wine we're talking about here. It's helpful to remember that weddings at the time of Jesus weren't a one-day or part-of-the-day affair. It was a week-long party. You may have thought you have been to some long and wild weddings, but let me assure you, these people knew how to do it. They would have left you all in your tracks, I tell you. But because of the length of it, the host would serve the good wine at the beginning when people were at least semi-aware of what they were consuming. And then, as we heard, after they kind of really had at it and were kind of gone a little bit, that's when you break out the cheap stuff. And so it would have been a big deal if they had run out of wine in the midst of a very big party. And they needed a lot of wine, but if you calculate how much wine resulted from this miracle, it's about 180 gallons of wine. I mean, it's way more than these people could even go through. And I like this part about this story, that it's great that Jesus saves the party. I like that. Jesus, the party saver, you know? It's a good thing. But it's an odd miracle, or sign, as we're told that it's called in the Gospel of John, to recount as the first miracle that Jesus performed. In fact, John is the only gospel where this miracle occurs. And why water into wine? Why this event to say this is the first miracle? This is a big thing. I mean, no one had their life at stake here. No one was suffering. No one was in dire need, except maybe some of the guests felt they were in dire need of a drink. But what was going on here? Mark tells us that the first miracle that Jesus performed in his ministry was casting out a demon. And Luke says the same thing. That's the first miracle Jesus performed. And Matthew says the first miracle that Jesus performed was curing a leper. Now those are good, helpful miracles. That really does something for someone in need. But making a bunch of incredibly nice wine so people could just party on strong for the next several days? Nah, something more has to be going on here. So what the heck is going on? Well, I don't know. I'm not going to presume to tell you I can explain it all, because I can't. As a friend of mine says, reading the Gospel of John is like dropping a coin or a rock into one of those wells that you can't see the bottom, and you drop it, and you kind of wait and wait and wait to hear it land. Things are always deeper than they seem in the Gospel of John, and it's more full of meaning the more we read it. And there's layer upon layer that kind of needs to be digested before we ever get to the bottom of it, if we can ever get to the bottom of it. And I think with John's Gospel, sometimes you never get to the bottom of it. But let me share just a few things very quickly that I think help me get something out of this passage. I think the first thing that helps me approach this is to note, as I mentioned earlier, that in John's Gospel, these events are never called miracles. They are called signs. In other words, they are always pointing beyond the event to something more. In other words, the miracle, the water into wine, is never really the focus. They're all trying to push us out to see something more, and to see something more about Jesus. And one of the things that seems evident to me is this sign, this miracle, reveals and shows Jesus as the one who brings about transformation. Jesus is the one who changes things and brings new life and brings a whole heck of a lot of joy into life as well. I also think it's significant that Jesus takes everyday, ordinary water and brings forth joy and life. One writer has noted it's a little bit like at the beginning of the Bible where God goes to the water and out of the water brings out life. In this story, Jesus goes to the water and he brings out rich and wonderful wine. And some of you may be aware that the great Hebrew prophets like Isaiah and Joel and Amos, when they would talk about God coming and restoring Israel, and when the Messiah would come, they said that the mountains and especially the streams would run with wine. Rich wine was a sign of God's presence and God's blessing and God's favor. So what strikes me, though, is this Jesus taking the ordinary stuff, ordinary clay jars and water from a well, and transforming them and changing them into life and hope. I like that. Jesus takes what is right before him, and from it, something new happens. It's not just some same old wine, it's really different. And it makes me think that maybe one of the challenges this story holds for you and for me is to seek and recognize Christ in that what is part of our life. The isness, if there is such a word, of life. When we do, I think, commonplace objects, familiar faces, familiar places begin to reflect something more that is really there. And I wonder, especially on this week, and I wonder if that was one of the great gifts of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and other religious leaders. They could look at the what is and help us see something more and deeper and richer that was really waiting to burst forth. You know, I was thinking about how Next Tuesday, some of you are going to go to Loaves and Fishes and serve a meal. And I thought, that's just a simple, common thing to do, serve a meal. But when you serve a meal to people in need, and you invite Jesus into it, it becomes richer and fuller. And there is a sense of hope, even a sense of joy for people who don't have it. Water becomes wine in a way. Being a Christian, I think, is being a part of this changing process of taking what is water and clay jars and having something better and richer occur. I think you and I are constantly called to the simple work of taking the everydayness, the givenness, the what is of our lives, and inviting Jesus to be a part of it. So through us, things are transformed. Through us, something of deeper and richer value is given to others.